Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alex Sharpe. It's actually sharp like a knife. There's an E on the end. We're honored today to have Dean Schlesinger speak with us, and I feel very honored to have been asked to moderate this. I'm a very proud alumni of the Whiting School of Engineering, so being able to moderate a session with the dean is it's incredible. I'm very active in the Alumni Society. I started my career at NSA, working in what we now call cybersecurity, and moved into digital transformation. So what the dean is talking about today is very much on point. It's all about how technology really drives a lot of value. He's coming at it from the perspective of being a technologist looking at the future. Like the dean, I'm also a science fiction fan. What I found in the sessions leading up to this, that he has probably forgotten more about science fiction than I will ever know. He's clearly going to beat me in trivia. So very excited today to have him here for the Hopkins at Home Dean's Notebook series. The title is Star Trek Science Fiction and the Future. The dean, in addition to being the dean of Whiting School of Engineering, he previously held positions at Carnegie Mellon University, where he was head of electrical and computer engineering. In addition to a deep background as an educator, he's also has a deep background as a technologist with some special expertise in solid state, optical devices, and information storage systems. He's both a fellow at the IEEE and the SPIE, which is the IEEE for optics. He's a prolific writer with over 250 articles and 15 patents. In addition to all that, because it can't be enough, he has served on a bunch of advisory committees and organizations across the globe. Like I mentioned before, he's a big science fiction fan who likes to think about the future. One thing to point out is he is a big fan of the original Star Trek. Like all of us, he likes them all, but he's a big fan of the original Star Trek. So with that said, I will turn it over to the dean, and let's hear what he has to say. Very excited to do this. Thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Alex. And good afternoon, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here and have a chance to have a little bit of fun, a little bit of nostalgia, and a little bit of serious thoughts about the future and where we might end up. And so hence my talk, Star Trek science fiction and thoughts about the future. As Alex said, I've been a fan of science fiction since I was a kid. Even in elementary school, I read every science fiction book I could get my hands on in the library and beyond. And eventually, of course, got to see the original Star Trek series. And I think that original Star Trek series was very interesting for a lot of different reasons, and I'll discuss some of them. But one should remember that that was a series that came on television in the late 60s, which means that we're already talking about 60 years ago, and the context of the times were quite different. And so it was really fairly significant, some of the ideas that were proposed and imagined in that series. But in any event, to get us started, let me start by talking about science fiction and why I think it's an interesting test bed for the future. Science fiction is not only a predictor of technology. People often focus on the gadgetry. It's actually an excellent medium to explore societal issues because you're in a different world at a different time, and so it gives you license to suggest ideas and suggest things that may or may not be acceptable at the time that they're put forward. We'll talk a little bit about that. And science fiction is also a great opportunity, a test bed to explore the interplay of technology and society. How does technology change society? How does it change people and their behaviors? And so we'll talk also a little bit about that. Now, having said that, we're going to talk about the future. I am mindful of a very famous quote that Niels Bohr made, and it is Niels Bohr who said this, that prediction is indeed very difficult especially of the future. And that has been the case, that has been demonstrated throughout history. Um, for example, in aviation, Lord Kelvin said, "I have not the smallest molecule of faith in aerial navigation other than ballooning." He made that statement in 1870. Of course, in 1903, the Wright brothers demonstrate heavier than air flight. So it took him 33 years to be absolutely wrong about his prediction of the future. And in aviation, not somewhat surprisingly, the flying machines will eventually be fast. They will be used in sport, but they should not be thought of as commercial carriers. That was a statement made by Octave Chanute, a French-American aviator who actually advised the Wright brothers, a leader in aviation technology. And then by 1926, there was the first civilian sustained regular domestic airline service um, by German airlines. Um, and then in 1926, you have 8 passengers on a commercial airliner. So it took him only 16 years to be wrong about his predictions. In communications, it's not just in aerial navigation. Lee DeForest, one of the pioneers of communications technologies, said that while theoretically and technically television may be feasible commercially and financially, I consider it an impossibility, a development of which we need waste little time dreaming. TVs began to come out commercially in 1928. You'll notice it only took him 2 years to be absolutely wrong. And you see a pattern here. And eventually, space technologies, space travel is utter bilge, said Sir Richard van der Riet Woolley, the astronomer royal, in 1956. It only took him 1 year to be absolutely wrong. So what you see here is that not only is it difficult to make predictions of the future, one ends up being wrong faster and faster and faster as time goes on. So what can we say about predicting the future? I think you can say a few things with some certainty. The first is, I would say, that technology, more than ever before, truly is changing all aspects of how people live. There's no human activity today, I would argue, that is not in some way affected by technology, enabled by technology, changed by technology, mitigated by technology. I really think you would be hard pressed to think of a human activity, from relationships to religion to education to medicine to anything you want to think about, that isn't in some way affected by technology. And it's always brought change to the world, positive and negative, dislocation and disruption, great dangers. When some prehistoric genius managed to create fire, could use that to cook your food, you could use that to burn the village next door down to the ground. So that's not new either. So predicting exactly how things will change is impossible, but predicting that change and disruption will occur, in my opinion, is a certainty. And we've seen that, as I said, throughout history. And I'll just give you one more example of that. Think about Gutenberg and the invention of movable type. It created enormous dislocation and disruption. It changed the balance of power between institutions and individuals. Because of movable type, Gutenberg did not invent the printing press, he invented movable type. Books started being published in the vernacular. Latin declined as a language. Authorship suddenly mattered. Pages were numbered because now the pages are the same from one copy to the next. Literacy increases. Reading becomes a silent individual activity instead of a public activity. And the Reformation is advanced, and one could almost argue that that revolutions were enabled because of the invention of movable type and all that it implied in terms of communications technology and printing. And importantly, it also put into the hands of individuals, books, something that had been previously reserved for institutions. And that too is a manifestation of how things change because of technology, the empowerment of individuals. And you see institutions being undermined by technology all the time. Which institutions will lead, define, and drive the future? Very strong institutions can be undermined very quickly. And we have modern examples of that all over the place. Yellow Cab did not invent Uber. Capitol Records didn't invent iTunes. Marriott Hotels did not create Airbnb. Borders Books did not create Amazon. Rand McNally did not create Waze. So this idea that existing institutions have some sort of advantage and are able to control the future, I think is incorrect. And that too is a manifestation of disruption. So empowerment of individuals and undermining of institutions, all of this is part and parcel of what technology and engineering advance in the world. But I said we'd talk about Star Trek. So let's talk about Star Trek. Of course, one of the favorite devices in Star Trek is the communicator.
Perfect.
And nope.
Perfect.
And of course, we saw that device appear on the screen as appear on the scene as the Motorola flip phone, essentially. Today, of course, cell phones are even more capable than the communicator in Star Trek, but they predicted a gadget, and so that to me is interesting. Other predictions in Star Trek, the food synthesizer. And so we have a little clip here.
Children, now each card is a different flavor. You take your pick and the computer will mix your favorite combination. Now, what would you like? Just call out your favorites. Okay.
Right? For those of you who are Star Trek fans, you'll remember that device that just produced any food that you wanted just programmed with, in that case, what looked more like a floppy disk. Of course, we have that today. We essentially have that technology as predicted by Star Trek. The computer interface, that was one of the things that in Star Trek was a revelation. You remember it was a voice-activated computer who could talk back to you.
Stardate 2794.7.
Stop.
Photos.
Information on Anton Caridian.
Director and star of Traveling Company of Actors, sponsored by Galactic Cultural Exchange Project.
That computer, by the way, the voice was of the same actress who was in the previous clip playing Nurse Chapel and who was Gene Roddenberry's spouse. Today, we have interfaces like ChatGPT, and so I'm going to turn on the microphone and talk to my favorite computer interface. This is not recorded. This is real time. For those of you who have not used ChatGPT's voice, you may want to try that. It's pretty interesting, but here goes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Tell me, are you a person?
I'm not a person. I'm an AI. Here to help you out.
So, do you know about the original Star Trek series?
Yes, the original Star Trek series, which aired in the 1960s, featured Captain Kirk, Spock, and the crew of the USS Enterprise exploring space. It's a classic.
Which is your favorite episode from the original Star Trek series?
That's a tough choice. The City on the Edge of Forever is a popular favorite. It's a really touching episode. Do you have a favorite?
I do. I like that episode quite a bit as well. Remind me, who was the actress who played Edith Keeler?
Edith Keeler was played by Joan Collins. She did an amazing job in that episode.
and a character that's really different than what she played later on in her career, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's quite different from her later roles, like Alexis Carrington in Dynasty. It shows her range as an actress.
Well, I've turned off the microphone, but I could go on and have a discussion with this computer for quite some time. So again, Star Trek seemed to predict that gadgetry quite well into the future. But Star Trek also dealt with societal and social change, and that was interesting as well. A clip that, again, in the late 60s was quite interesting that they dealt with this social
It is
problem.
obvious to the most simple-minded that Loci is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me. Look at me. I am black on the right side. Loci is white on the right side. All of his people are white on the right side.
So apparently, the ability to talk about societal big questions in society, but because it's in the science fiction context, we're given leave to discuss this. And
It is obvious to the...
oops. And then, of course, there's a very famous scene, an interracial kiss on Star Trek. Again, something profoundly new in the late 1960s, not the only or the first interracial kiss, but certainly one that created quite a stir. And then there's even more discussion of the interplay of technology and society in the episode that this clip is taken from.
This is no game, Captain. 500,000 people have just been killed. Activate the attack unit, sir. Yes, Councilman. Launch immediate counterattack.
Computers, Captain. They fight their war with computers, totally.
In other words, in this episode, not only were the wars fought by computers, but in order to maintain the war for 500 years, according to this episode, people willingly went into disintegration machines in order to appease the enemy while at the same time preserving their own society. And so that interesting play or interaction of society and technology, which brings me to something that I really think about a fair amount. Indeed, how is our world going to be changed by technology in everything that we do? And really, already today, things are changing very, very quickly. In medicine, for example, we are using AI and data science to begin to think about diagnoses of disease states aided by AI systems. And while many people think, well, that's one area where AI will advance, but perhaps it won't advance surgery. One can look at recent work that was done here at Hopkins, where a robot that watched surgery videos learned how to perform skills that we think of as reserved for a human doctor. And so there's disruption in medicine already happening, already on its way. In movies, in acting, in television, we might think that that is not going to be affected by technology, but it already has been. If you think about Star Wars, not Star Trek, Episode 4, A New Hope, released in 1977, Peter Cushing played the role of Grand Moff Tarkin. He reprised that role in Rogue One that was released in 2016. He again played Grand Moff Tarkin. The difference was that he had died in 1994. His entire role in that movie in 2016 was from a computer-aided, computer-generated character. And so indeed, in Hollywood today, there is a lot of talk about whether there's an existential threat to actors through AI systems. In education, we are definitely in a time of great change because of AI and technology. This is an illustration from a 14th century manuscript. It shows Henry of Germany delivering a lecture to students at the University of Bologna. The University of Bologna is the oldest continuously operating university in the world. But if you look at this image, you essentially see a classroom that looks not much different than classrooms today. You've got the lecturer at the front. You've got the students in the first rows, very attentive with their books open. By the time you get to the third row, students are actually talking to each other, and only one student has his or her book open, and nobody's paying attention in the back row. So, a situation that is all too familiar to many lecturers in universities today. And you'll see one student prominently asleep in the third row. I think the only difference today between this classroom scene and a classroom scene today would be that if there was an iPhone in the hand of that student, he actually wouldn't be asleep. He would be actually playing on his iPhone. And we've seen disruption. Recently, I got an email from a colleague Rama Chalapa, Professor Chalapa is one of our leading computer scientists. And as he says in this email, he asked ChatGPT to provide solutions to his midterm, and it gave perfect answers, which basically means you now have a computer-generated kid in the classroom who is the smartest kid in the classroom, at least in terms of answering the questions. And so this raises the issue of, what are we teaching our students? How are we teaching our students? How are we assessing our students? Homework is no longer a useful pedagogical tool, at least homework in the sense of giving problem sets that can be completed in a short period of time. Because today, anybody could ask ChatGPT or other AI systems to provide the answers to the homework problems. And so we have to really think about what we're doing in education going forward. And this disruption also is happening now. Back in 2016 already, Georgia Tech used what was then Jill Watson as a computer AI. And in the first semester that they used Jill Watson, they didn't tell the students that the TA was actually a computer-generated AI. And from colleagues that I knew at Georgia Tech, they told me that the students were about to actually nominate her for a Best TA award, as even though she was an AI, that they didn't realize that she was an AI. So, and Georgia Tech continues to do this and to use this AI as a teaching assistant. And while they try to keep as you see here, the teaching assistant, they try to keep it from hallucinating and giving incorrect answers, you can be sure that human TAs also often give incorrect answers. So that issue is not specific to AIs, at least in this context. And that disruption has already changed the marketplace. A company that you may or may not have ever heard of by the name of Chegg, launched in 2006. By March of 2020, they reported to have 2.9 million subscribers. This was a company that provided online tutoring and other student services. And because of ChatGPT, a company that had in 2020 millions of subscribers, their stock had gone down by 99% and basically had lost its market because of that. So lots of disruptions, some unpredictable, but I'd like to suggest one that I can predict in terms of the interplay of AI and technology and society. And so I want to talk about a predictable disruption. Vehicles, cars. It turns out that it doesn't matter almost what country in the world you are living in, the number of vehicles per capita GDP goes up more or less linearly and then saturates out at approximately 800 vehicles per individual per capita GDP. And so actually, right, for 1,000 inhabitants. So you normalize all these countries to their population and their per capita GDP, and you see that every country increases the number of vehicles on the road essentially in proportion to its population and its proportion to its per capita GDP. And what's the consequence of all these vehicles on the road? Traffic deaths. Imagine that every day, all year round, 17 or so mid-sized passenger airplanes crashed, killing everyone on board. Every day, 17 air disasters. That's basically how many people die in car crashes every day around the world. According to the World Health Organization, 3,200 traffic deaths a day, about 1.2 million people a year. In the United States alone, nearly 43,000 people dying every year due to traffic fatalities. Leading cause of death for children and young adults between ages 5 and 29. 92% of the world's fatalities occur in low and middle income countries, even though they have fewer vehicles, but that's because the infrastructure is perhaps not as good. And basically reduce countries' gross domestic product by maybe 3% because of all these deaths. So what do I know as an engineer? What do I believe as an engineer? I think that self-driving cars powered by AI systems will address this problem and likely solve it. I think that it'll make a huge difference. In fact, I go beyond belief. I feel that I know that self-driving cars will save millions of lives. And to those people who feel uncomfortable with the idea of a car driving itself and them not behind the wheel, I will say, well, it's not for you. You're an excellent driver. It's for all of those other idiots on the road who shouldn't be driving. And then people say, oh, yeah, those people, they should be taken off the road. But all kidding aside, autonomous vehicles will save lives, and they'll even do more. They'll increase mobility in an aging population, which will reduce the cost of medical care. It'll allow elderly folks to remain independent because they'll have personal independent mobility. Because they're programmed, they're tested, they're optimized, because they aren't checking their texts or doing any one of a number of other things. They'll just be driving in the most efficient way and the safest way. They'll reduce traffic congestion, which will reduce pollution. It'll lower fuel consumption, whether that fuel is electricity or fossil fuel. They'll increase productivity. All those people who right now are driving their cars will not have to be paying attention to driving. They'll be able to do other things. You'll no longer need parking spaces in cities because autonomous vehicles will likely be used 24/7. Look around any city and think about how many cars are just parked, all those resources just sitting there, not being used for anything. Enormous benefits, lives saved. But driving is a huge employment source. According to the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, between heavy and tractor trailer drivers, delivery truck drivers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, nearly 5 million people are employed as drivers in the United States. Now let that number sink in. I'll remind folks who might remember a less than optimal statement that then candidate Hillary Clinton made about coal miners and the political cost of making that statement about coal miners. At the time, there were 60,000 coal miners in the United States. 5 million, nearly 5 million drivers. That does not include Uber and Lyft and such. If we have autonomous driving that will give us all those benefits and save all those lives, millions of people, primarily men, are going to be unemployed. And what does that mean for this country from a societal point of view? What does it mean from a voting point of view? What will these people do? And this disruption is happening now. Waymo, which is only in 3 cities and 3 limited areas in those cities, is already driving 1 million miles a week, offering 150,000 robo-taxi rides per week. Those are rides that are not being offered by human drivers. So this is happening now. What are we going to do about it? Are we thinking about it? I think the answer is we're probably not thinking about it. So what are the lessons to keep in mind as I think about all of these things put together? The first is technological advances can empower individuals, can place in the hand of individuals capabilities previously controlled by institutions. And institutions need to understand that what they believe they control and where they think they have an exclusive capability may not be the case and may disappear overnight. Technology changes the world in areas where we might have believed disruptive change is not possible. Changes that some people might believe might take years or generations to occur might in fact happen overnight. And these societal and institutional dislocations and disruptions have consequence. And we have to be prepared to lead, shape, and respond to these. Some of these dislocations create opportunities for institutions and for individuals, but some really cause challenges that need to help and that institutions need to help people navigate through the change. And so what do I think about the future? I think there's a lot of opportunity, but there's a lot of challenge. And I think we're going to need a lot of different expertise to address these challenges, not just engineers and technologists, but the humanists, the ethicists, the artists, the attorneys, the economists, the teachers, the natural scientists, the social scientists, the policy experts. All of these folks are going to have to consider and deal with these changes that we are already seeing. In short, everyone needs to be aware of these. And as I keep saying, great benefits, great opportunities, great challenges. And we're going to have to anticipate these changes, and we're going to have to think about them now and work thoughtfully and carefully to maximize the benefit and minimize the harm. And this is where I think a place like Johns Hopkins has a unique role to play, because we do have engineering and medicine and social science and education and nursing and public health and international studies, and now a school of governance and policy and business and Peabody and so forth. The full spectrum of what we do at this university has to be brought to bear on making sure that these challenges are addressed in the most effective, thoughtful, and positive manner. And so with that, I'll just say thank you for listening to me. And I hope you'll agree that Johns Hopkins Engineering is indeed working to create a better future. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dean. That really was very insightful. I really appreciate that. We're getting questions in from the audience, and I'd like to dive in if you're ready.
Sure.
Interestingly enough, the first two, so we got a handful of questions. The first two tied directly to conversations we had in our prep call for this. So, great minds think alike. The first one I want to bring up is Joseph asks about teleportation, right? How close are we? I naturally go back to the Star Trek version of that, and, especially given your presentation, but, we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think we're pretty far away from teleportation, although sometimes I say jokingly to engineering classes, I actually have the transporter half figured out. I know how to disintegrate you into your constituent molecules. I just don't know how to put you back together yet. So I got it half worked out. But I think we're pretty far away from that. Although there have been there's been some work on quantum teleportation, at least the use of the term, but that's a very, very different thing. And it seems to be one of those gadgets that's substantially further away than anything we talked about.
Very cool. So Joseph, just to let you know the history, when we were talking the other day about, prepping for this, we talked about all the devices that have become true, just like the dean mentioned. And we talked about how also Gene Roddenberry, when he created Star Trek, he stuck to the physical principles, and they had to create the transporter because they couldn't figure out how to land the Enterprise. And Gene Roddenberry's being told he can't do it because of Heisenberg, all this other stuff. So he came up with this idea of creating this magical device called a Heisenberg compensator. And he's like, but that doesn't exist. That's fine. We got 500 years for somebody to figure it out. You know, perfect for what we're talking about today, dead on. Now, Gabe brings up another one that's a little closer, closer, warp drive.
Yeah. So every science fiction book that involves space travel posits a solution to the problem of the interstellar distances, right? You can't travel from star to star if you're limited by the speed of light. And of course, with relativity, even if you're able to approach the speed of light, then the passing of time on board the spaceship versus back on Earth creates an impossibility in terms of communications and coming back to the Earth. So every science fiction story is forced to create something like a warp drive or some aspect of this. In Dune, they talk about this, and the Guild navigators warp bending space, and there too, I think we are at least based on known physics today, we are not going to see a warp drive anytime soon.
Very cool. Very cool. I like the way you tied that all together. My dad used to say the advantage that science fiction movies have is the writers are on their side.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, Gabe went on and asked about other types of drives and solar sailing. Let's get some other questions in here, and maybe we'll come back. There's some really good stuff in here. Karen asked an interesting question. You know how you talked about how it's very hard to predict the future, you know, with Niels Bohr, and they're learning because of the way technology is advancing and productivity is increasing. People are learning that they are more wrong faster. Okay. Karen asked an interesting question. Has anybody looked at the lag time between predictions in science fiction and reality?
So actually, I don't know about specifically the lag time, but one of our own alums from the Whiting School, so this is a pitch for Ed Wysocki. You can look up some of the writings that he's done on this. Ed actually has written a number of books. It's available on Amazon, I believe. They're available on Amazon, and about the history of technologies and when they were first mentioned in science fiction writings and when they eventually came to be. In other words, how that process. So I don't know about lag time, but I will say that certainly a great many ideas, again, science fiction gives people license to think out of the box. A great many ideas have certainly come to pass in reality. What's also interesting, though, is how some things came to pass that we thought would come to pass, and some things we thought would come to pass didn't come to pass. So, for example, certainly when I was a kid and we saw the moon landings in 1969 and early 70s, if you would have told me that 55 years later we had essentially abandoned that, and that only now we're thinking about going back to the moon, I and certainly the adults at the time would have thought that was crazy. Of course, we're going to have moon colonies by the 21st century. And the fact that none of that came to pass was a surprise. At the same time, developments like the internet and smartphones, probably nobody thought about at the time. And so it's just interesting how some things come to pass and come to pass quickly, and some things you think are going to come to pass still haven't come to pass.
Very cool. So I'm going to pull a couple of questions together and bundle them, and then we'll go back to some very specific questions. But one of the themes in here, and I'm going to couch it trying to catch the essence. And if I'll say to the audience, if you think I missed part of it, feel free to say something. We'll catch up to it. But with these movies, particularly around AI, right? We basically have two types of movies over the past 50, 60 years, right? We have the ones that are a very hopeful view, like the Jetsons and Star Wars and Star Trek, where these machines really do make our lives better, right? AI makes the life better. And then we have these dystopic movies, things like The Predator, and a few others that are really kind of negative, right? The machines take over. What do you think about that? Does that create a foundation where it's maybe like a cautionary tale, so we worry more about safety and security from the start, or is it more of a just prediction of being human?
Yeah, so I think you said Predator, but you may have meant the Terminator.
I'm sorry, Terminator.
Terminator.
Good
Uh,
catch.
and just for those who are fans of that series, John Connor has already been born, and Skynet has already become self-aware. And by the year 2025, things are in pretty bad shape in that dystopian future. Um, so it's a great question. I will tell you that I'm fundamentally optimistic. And I think if we use history as a guide, what do we see? We see horrible periods of history where technology has been used in the worst imaginable way possible. Wars of ever greater scale being enabled. People thought that World War I, the war to end all wars, who would have thought that at the time it wasn't called World War One because nobody imagined that there could be a World War Two. And so you see that, and that gives you pause. At the same time, if you look at the world today and you ask yourself, at which period of history would it be best to be living? If I gave you the choice to live at any period of time in history, when would it be best to be alive? The truth of it is, on average, right now. And everything from because more people in the world today have access to food and vaccines and education and communication than have ever had access to this before. It's not to say that everyone in the world has access to all these things, but more people have access to these things at a better level than ever before. And so if humanity could just be a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more careful, there's every reason to believe, in my opinion, that the future can actually be better and can continue to improve. Which is not to say that there won't be evil in the world, quite frankly, that will use technology to achieve the wrong things. That's what we have to be on the lookout for.
That's interesting because that also ties back to your point before about technology advances are neither good nor bad. They can be used either way. And we've seen history has told us that humans do that,
Yes,
right? That's
absolutely.
very interesting point. So one of the attendees, Tim, is asking about assessment models. And it looks like he's talking about in an education environment, how do you assess students? That's very interesting. That ties directly into some of the stuff you're talking about. What's your views on that?
So I think that's one of the challenging questions right today, because as I pointed out, simply asking students questions on traditional tests, even if they're able to do that, one and perform well on that, the question is, well, is there value in being able to do that? Or is there, given that we have tools that can do that better than humans, at least in some cases today, can already do it better than humans. So, and by the way, we've been through this question and through these changes before. Mine was the last class in my high school class. Sorry, mine was the first high school math class that skipped over the chapter in our math textbook on how to use a slide rule. So I actually never learned how to use a slide rule. Why? Because calculators were becoming ubiquitous. And there was a lot of discussion. Should we allow calculators in the classroom? Should we allow calculators on tests? And there were all sorts of opinions. At the end of the day, the calculators won. You couldn't stop it. Now, that's not to say it didn't have a negative impact as well. There are students today who, if you ask them, high school students, smart high school students, excellent high school students, but you ask them, tell me, what's 6 times 8? They will be hard pressed to give you an answer because they haven't memorized multiplication tables. That's not so worrying to me. What's worrying to me is, have they lost the ability to say, well, I don't know what 6 times 8 is, but 6 times 10, that's easy. That's 60. And 8 is 2 less than 10. So 2 times 6 is 12. So I subtract 12 from 60 and I get my answer of 48 for 6 times 8. That reasoning is what we need to test and what we need to be able to teach our students. And I think AI really is that calculator, but on steroids. So what's my answer to that? Well, I don't have a very sophisticated answer yet. I think this is something that I and all of my colleagues, and not just at Hopkins, will have to think about carefully. But one answer is that education will have to be much more about solving new problems as opposed to regurgitating answers to old problems, which is not to say you don't teach the fundamentals. You still have to teach the fundamentals, because if I don't teach you enough about the fundamentals, you don't even know what questions to ask, and you certainly don't understand the answers that are given to you. So you need to absolutely learn the fundamentals. But at some point when the educational process becomes just about information transfer, that's where I think we have to switch gears and say, no, no, no. Additional information you can acquire for yourself. It's about designing new solutions to new problems. And my mechanism of assessing you is about whether you have come up with a clever, implementable, desirable solution to a problem that I've set to you. And when I say problem, I mean solving a real world problem, designing a system that addresses that real world problem. And maybe I put cost constraints on the solution. Maybe I put aesthetic constraints on the solution. Maybe I put, of course, technological constraints on the solution. And I assess you on how good is your solution to a problem that you've never seen before, as opposed to how good are you at simply solving problems that are put in front of you with known sort of closed form solutions.
Excellent, very thoughtful points. Very thoughtful points. I like that a lot. I'm curious to see how this evolves, because to your point, it's a different way of teaching and testing that it's going to cause some changes in the education system that we may not have thought through yet. That's very insightful.
And if you think about it, if I may, just
Please.
to add a little bit to this, again, for those of us who are old enough, we will remember that there was a time not that long ago that one of the metrics that universities would be proudly talking about themselves. Why is this university so great? We have 5 million volumes in our library. How many books a university had in their library was a metric, was a measure of how great that university is. No university today would tout the number of books they have in their library. Why? Because I can essentially get access to any book in the world within 24 hours, no matter where I am. Said another way, to the extent that universities were founded in the first place, because that's where the books were, and that's where the people who could read the books were. And I could go there and be educated by the people who were literate and knew how to read the books, and they could teach me how to read the books and answer my questions. To the extent that that's why universities existed in the first place, that's not actually needed so much anymore about the books. But universities as creators of new knowledge. This is why the research mission is so integral to the educational mission. The idea that we're creating new knowledge, that we're discovering new knowledge, that students are learning not just what's in the books, because information is ubiquitous now, but rather learning how to access information, how to think about solutions to problems. And this is, by the way, not, although this may sound like I'm talking about engineering, I think this is actually true across all disciplines. That's what we have to focus on as educators slash researchers slash people who bring good benefit to society.
So that's really interesting, and we have to push it aside. But what you're talking about is the thought process and critical thinking. And that's
Absolutely.
much more than just science and engineering. It goes onto a lot of social issues. And if you look at the stuff going on with social media, that's at the heart, right? So that's excellent thoughts.
And so, for example, again, sorry to jump in, but governance structures. What are the right governance structures? This is not an engineering question. And I don't even, and not just governance structures about AI and data science, but governance structures in general in our society. And how do we form policies? And can we use AI to help us create policies that don't have unintended consequences, and so on and so forth?
All right. So you got a little telekinesis going on here because there's actually a question in the thread about the use of guardrails, right? Guardrails is a form of a governance structure. Use of guardrails on the development and deployment of advancing technology. What do you think about what's the role of guardrails?
So first of all, one has to define technologically what that means exactly, and policy-wise what that means. But I think there too, there's a great. Let me give you an example where I think again it speaks to the need of having more than just engineering in the conversation. So let's say that one of the guardrails that we want to put on AI systems in an international geopolitical context is that we want to sign a treaty with a foreign country that neither of us will allow AI's systems without human intervention to control our weapon systems. That seems like a reasonable thing to say, you won't let your AI control your weapon system, but we won't let our AI control our weapon system. Well, how does one negotiate such a treaty? I need to work with my colleagues in the School of Advanced International Studies so they can explain to me how they go about negotiating such a treaty. But then they need to also talk to the engineers and the computer scientists to ask questions like, how would you ever formally verify whether the other country is adhering to the treaty? What's the mechanism by which we could be reassured that if we establish those guardrails, they will establish those guardrails? And so I think that's another example where it's not just the engineers, it's the engineers working with policymakers about international treaties are going to have to figure out how to establish those guardrails. So for me, the word guardrail it's a general term for if you want to put limitations on things, that's great, but we have to define what those limitations are. How do you verify that those limitations are effective? How do you confirm that those limitations are in place? How do you confirm that the other person that maybe you need them to adhere to the same limitation is really adhering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Excellent. Um, Following up on that, there's a couple of questions here about education in today's cultural climate. Now, if if you don't want to go there, I think we'll all understand. But a couple of the students are asking about how to how to teach and educate in today's cultural climate. What are your thoughts on that? Or do you have any?
So my thoughts about that are that generally speaking, information and the accessibility to information is a good thing. The challenge in today's world is how do I create systems that can help me know when the information that I'm getting is valid, is not misinformation or disinformation. Um, in fact, how do I even know that the person I may be talking to on the other side of the social network is actually a human being, not, as I showed, a chatbot of some sort? And there's lots of reasons why people might create non-human actors on the internet to put forward their own points of view. So I think the challenge is how do we make sure that we have highly curated sources of information that I can actually rely on? One of my colleagues, actually it was Rama Chalapa, suggested to me that maybe one way that we deal with misinformation and disinformation on online is that it actually evolves into a medium where we just treat it like a tabloid. And this is rather sad that this would happen, but in the same way that when you check out of the supermarket line, you see these tabloids, and whether people buy them or not for entertainment or for whatever reason, there's generally a sense that, well, a space alien abducted my spouse in News of the World. It's a tabloid. It's funny. I don't really take that seriously. I take certain publications that I have confidence in as being curated and reliable, the Financial Times or the Economist or the Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever. I think of those as reliable sources of information. So maybe what happens is that the social media platforms become like tabloids. I may use them, but I may not take them seriously. And so the question is, can we set up systems where we have highly curated and highly reliable sources of information? But information is very, very important and very valuable.
That's a very interesting analogy to the physical tabloid world, the days of paper to the electronic world. Very interesting analogy. Thank you for that. We really only have one time for one more question, even though we have a lot of really good ones in the chat. Um, the best one I'm seeing here, right on point with what you discussed, the title and all that. What do you predict will be wrong about in 1 year's time?
So of course, I think that everything I said will be right, because if I thought it was going to be wrong, I wouldn't have shared it with you.
You would have changed it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So by definition, I can't answer that question.
Good answer. Good answer. Let me try to squeak another one in just because we got a little time here. Um, Raymond talks about the book 1984, right? He obviously missed by the date,
Mm-hmm.
but how do we avoid the reality, that dystopic reality at some point in the future?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and um, um, depending on how world history evolves, one could imagine going into that kind of dystopic future. Um, Big Brother is to an extent already watching us.
Yep.
Um, it's just that there isn't, at least right now, as far as we know, a centralized authority that's controlling everything that we do. What is interesting is, and again, this is something one could talk about at great length, the concept of privacy and the concept of anonymity have changed over human history. There was at least one Supreme Court justice, might have been Brandeis, who defined privacy actually as the right to be left alone, which is different than the right to withhold my information from the government. And so there is an evolution in society. Some aspects of 1984 are already with us, of course. I think this is another one of those questions where it's not just an engineering question, it's a societal governance kind of structural question of how we ensure that we don't end up in a completely dystopian version of the world.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that. So unfortunately, we're out of time. We actually ran about 2 minutes over, but nobody seems to be complaining. Thank you for the presentation and the discussion. It's unfortunate we have to leave, but that's the way the world works. So just to the audience, thank you for attending. We have many more of these sessions coming up. Hopkins alumni and the Hopkins University infrastructure does have other events going on. Please keep your eye out for them. If you have any suggestions, like anything else, we'd love to hear from you. And thanks again for attending, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.